So welcome. My name is Proulx. I'm a researcher at the National Research Council of Canada, the CNRC, Council National de Recherche Canada. And I study the convergence of game technology and VR, specifically with health. So how can we use those technologies to improve health? The National Research Council of Canada is the largest federal research institution in the country. We have institutes all over Canada, and we study pretty much anything from astronomy to composting. It's really like a very, very wide area of research. And I'm part of a subgroup, a small lab that is part of Immersive that is concerned with simulation and digital health. And we're located in Boucherville, basically next to the IKEA. The NRC's mission is really to focus on applied science. So our goal is to be advancing knowledge, but in the context of supporting Canadian economy and solving problems that are significant society issues for Canadians. And the great thing about the project we're working on is that it touches on all three aspects of the mission. Well, obviously, anything that has to do with VR is at the forefront of research. We don't know yet what to do with that technology that makes sense. But there's also a huge untapped market of people who have significant cognitive needs and are not getting their needs met. So that's both a society crisis. It doesn't make sense that we're not taking care of people's mental and cognitive health. But it's also an economic opportunity if we're able to use technology to improve the existing care and take care of people who need it. And it's been a topic of interest for a long time, but for many reasons, it's very hard to bridge the gap between academic research and entrepreneurship in that domain. There are super nice ideas being generated in labs and research hospitals all over the world, but you cannot really expect neuroscientists to write production quality software. And on the other hand, entrepreneurs might have good ideas, but they're unable to bridge the very big barrier of scientific evidence and clinical trials. So it's the gap that the NRC is trying to fill in order to help the whole ecosystem of cognitive health and technology. But before I talk about what we do at NRC, I wanted to give you an overview of what's going on in the field in general, and more specifically here in Quebec, because we are pretty much among the pioneers of that domain. Especially, there's a researcher at the Université du Québec en Outaouais, Stéphane Bouchard, who's been working with this for over a decade, I think. And he's a psychologist whose focus is anxiety, phobias, and addiction. And he's been making a lot of breakthroughs with VR, both on the theoretical side, exploring how VR relates to emotions and sense of presence, but also in very practical ways. He has an actual psychology practice, and he uses VR with actual patients for exposure therapy, being able to put people in situations that trigger them in the psychologist's office, and be able to work with them with cognitive therapy to be able to deal with those triggers. So basically, he's bringing whatever triggers their anxiety, their phobias, or their addiction behaviors right in their office. And he's written guidelines for how psychologists can actually use those tools in their real practice. So it's not just something out of science fiction. It is actually being used right now. There's also a very nice project at the Institut Pinel, which is here in Montreal. It's a psychiatric institute. And they were interested in schizophrenia patients who are not responding well to medication. So some schizophrenia patients are not able to control their hallucinations with medication alone. And this is extremely deliberating, as you can imagine. So their idea was to help patients build an avatar of their visions of the demons that inhabit them. And then they could be having a dialogue with their own demons in the psychiatrist's office, so that the psychiatrist speaks through the avatar's mouth, and they're able to learn how to respond to those hallucinations. And they've been having tremendous results. Most patients had an improvement of their symptoms, and some were able to get back to work. And that's a point that's very important in what we do. There's a lot, if you look on any app store, you're going to find a lot of apps that are supposed to improve your brain or your memory or your attention or your anxiety. And the problem is that most of these apps are not able to prove clinical effectiveness. It's not that you're not going to get better at that game. You are. But you're not necessarily, if it's a memory training program, you're not necessarily going to get better at remembering your keys or the name of your grandchild if you have early dementia. So we always have to keep in mind what are the real life outcomes. And that's the golden standard for us. That's what we always have to look for. And that's why it's so hard for businesses to actually bring products on the market, because proving real life outcomes is very difficult. Before we move on further, I kind of have to define two big concepts. The first is, what is cognition? I've been talking about cognitive health. Well, cognition is basically all the higher end functions of your brain. So it's an umbrella term that comprises a lot of things, including memory, attention, impulse control, how well you can control your emotions, how you can plan, how you can reflect on what you've been doing. And anytime some of those or many of those start not working optimally, you're going to have a cognitive deficiency. And that can be something you're born with. We know, for instance, that attention deficit disorder is something you're born with. It's how your brain is designed. And it can also be acquired, either through an injury, concussion, for instance. A serious concussion can create cognitive problems, or illness, the most obvious being Alzheimer's, but anything from multiple sclerosis to Parkinson's also has effects on your cognition. The other concept is the concept of brain plasticity. And brain plasticity is the idea that your brain can have long-lasting, long-term changes. And up until the 60s, neuroscientists pretty much thought that the brain was something fixed, that you were born with the brain in its final configuration, and it could decay, but it could not improve or change. And eventually we figured out that children had unspecialized brains, and that their brains specialized and changed as they grew into adulthood. But we still thought that that was a fixed process, and that once you were an adult, that was it, you could only go downwards. And it turns out that it's not true. Even in adulthood, some activities, actually most activities, have long-lasting changes to the structure of your brain. And the most, or one of the most studied topics for that is learning music. We know that if you learn a musical instrument in your childhood, you have markers in your brain well into adulthood of that learning. It changes your brain in a permanent way, and we can see that physically in your brain. But there's been also studies with elderly adults, and even older adults who have never learned music, who learn a musical instruments, are able to have cognitive gains, even if they're very old and at risk for mental health problems. So it's very encouraging that brain can actually grow and compensate and fix some of the defects or deficiencies it has. So why would we be interested in video games? Why not just teach everybody music if it works so well? Well, there are many reasons. The first is that video games are very affordable. We can have them in pretty much everyone's pocket. And if you think about how many hours of gaming you've played in your life versus how many hours of playing scales on the piano, so you probably see a big unbalance. Video games are also very precise. We can choose exactly what part of the brain we want to target. And we can also implement a feedback loop. We can see how the person reacts in very precise ways and change the game accordingly, especially now that game analytics and AI are taking such an important part in computer games. But I think the most important part is that games are fun. Humans have a built-in desire to play. And it's something that computer games tap into really, really well. Sometimes too well. So we can use that because any cognitive remediation process, like any rehab process, is going to be very long, very tedious. So if we can tap into that motivation, we have chances of helping people actually stick with their program and have actual progress. So why would we be interested in VR? It's not just because VR is cool, although it is, but VR helps put people in the kind of environment that they live through every day. In the domain, we say it's more ecologically valid. And we've also seen that VR creates true emotions. If you're in an environment with spiders and you're afraid of spiders, the fear that you experience is exactly the same kind of fear than with the real stimuli. And it doesn't even have to be a very nice spider. Just a sphere with 8 sticks is going to elicit the right kind of fear. And we don't have that with a computer screen. And if you think back of music, music uses all your cognitive abilities at once. It's not just targeting a single thing. It uses your memory, your visual processing, your auditory processing, your fine motor control, your attention. You're using everything at once, and it's a whole body experience. And VR lets us do the same kind of experiences where your whole body is challenged. And that's what we've been trying to do with our exercises. So it's not something, there's no consensus in the Rehab research environment about immersion being useful or essential for Rehab. Some people think that it's a gimmick. And it's still open for research, but we're hoping in our lab we're strongly in the camp that immersion is probably useful, and we're hoping to show that it does have a significant impact on both engagement and transfer to real life. So let's move on to the actual project. The project we've been working on for almost 2 years now is called Be Well. It's fully designed at the NRC from scratch. And you can think of it as the NRC's floor model of what we can do with cognition and VR. It's comprised of 7 exercises, some of which touch very specific elements of cognition, and some are more along the lines of activities of daily living and executive functions, so more complex whole body experiences that reflect the kind of task you have to do in your life. So we wanted to touch on both kinds of exercises. It's all built in Unity. And one of the nice things about using Unity is the superb multi-platform support it offers. So we've designed things from the ground up so that we could be able to support pretty much any VR platform out there with a single a single code branch. So we're able to build seamlessly between low-cost platforms that people might have at home and higher-end systems that might be in a clinic or an hospital lab. And we support VR and AR, so we can build for the Oculus and the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, but we also build for the Microsoft HoloLens. And we're trying to see how we can work with that technology as well. So today we're going to be making a demo of the Oculus, but we can really build for any platform. And we have like boxes and boxes of VR system in our lab that we even haven't unboxed yet. So pretty much, if it exists on the market, we're going to support it. And the idea is that we don't know what clinicians are going to have in their lab. So we can work with what they have and not just what we wish they would have. So the project is at the stage where we're just about to conclude partnerships with hospitals all over Canada and get started on actual clinical trials on patients. We've been trying it with healthy adults for cybersickness and engagement, and so far the results have been very good, and we've been discussing with neuroscientists and clinicians to guide our design. But now we're really, really, really close to actually testing this and passing the test of the test of fire, making sure that this actually works. So this is the moment you have all been waiting for. We're going to do a little demo. And this is Anne. Anne Cabral is my co-researcher on this. We've been working together since the beginning.
The guinea pig?
She's my guinea pig today. And she's very brave because it's tough to put on a headset in front of a big audience and not see what you're doing. Okay, so what you're seeing now, this is our menu, but it's also a playground. I'm just going to lower the volume a bit so I don't have to scream. Okay, so this is our playground for experiencing VR for the first time for most users. So we want them to be in a place where we're not measuring performance yet, but just give them a chance to explore the different kinds of interactions. So you can see there are asteroids flying by, so Anne can actually grab them. So this is one of the interactions that is possible. And no, you cannot throw them. Everybody wants to throw them. We cannot do that yet. And there's also gaze interaction. So if she looks at a planet, tu peux aller là. This is what serves as our menu. You can enter different worlds. So this is something that's been very challenging for us in VR, rethinking how interactions work. So there are some guidelines and ideas from the gaming industry that we've been exploring. But we also always have to keep in mind that our population is most likely going to be people who don't know much about games. If you're talking about somebody who's 70 and starting to show cognitive decline, chances are they've never played anything that resembles this in terms of computer games. So this is our first environment. This is, we call it the sensory tent. It's a place that is designed for anxiety management, but also for exploring all kinds of relaxation techniques. There is a breathing sphere there that grows and inflates and deflates at a rate that suggests relaxation. So if you follow that breathing pattern, it should lower your stress level and help your heartbeat be more stabilized. And it also provides sensory feedback. If Anne touches it, she's going to sense vibration.
It's vibrating, yeah.
So this is for patients who might need sensory stimulation to get grounded. This is something that is very common in autism spectrum kids, especially. They need that kind of vibration or physical stimulation to get control over their emotions. And you can choose different kinds of environments with the book. C'est bon, je me recule. So this is our first environment. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna teleport her so we don't have to go to the menu each and every time. Excuse-moi, faut que je te pause parce que j'ai pas mon switcher. On va-tu à la... OK, on va aller faire les modes. OK, so this is, the first one was not quite a game. This one is more of a game. This is a classical whack-a-mole kind of game. But the idea is that it's designed for impulse control because you have to respond to the stimuli, but you have to match the color of the mole with the color of the hammer. And the hammer color is going to change. So it's surprisingly difficult not to just react to what you're seeing. And this kind of game seems really simple, but it's based on experiments that was done with children. And we know that games where the rules change and where you have to respond to a stimuli are very good for learning impulse control. And impulse control is very directly linked with success in school, because if you don't think before you act, of course you're going to get in trouble, whatever the consequences are, because it doesn't go through your cognitive process. And this is a game that adapts automatically to the difficulty. So as Anne gets better, the moles are going to get faster as well. So we always try to make our games kind of open-ended. There's no failing. There's a bit of scoring, but not too much. And we adjust the difficulty so that people are always at about 80% of success. So they're always challenged, but they're not facing their failure over and over, because some people with limitations are going to find this very, very hard. So if you're an Alzheimer's patient that is fairly advanced, maybe you're going to have just one mole and a hammer and no timing, and that's going to be challenging enough for you. So we try to keep people challenged at the right level and to make those games very customizable for the clinicians. OK, on va aller voir les butterflies. OK, this one is a big favorite of my kids. It's a butterfly chase. So basically, Anne is going to try to catch the butterflies with her net. So it's another kind of possible interaction. But if you can see on her left hand, she has a gauge that tells us how much she's moving. And if she moves too much, the butterflies are going to flee away from her. And there are different kinds of butterflies. Some are really shy and really scared easily. Others are easier to catch. The pink ones are easy. So basically, she has to deal with multiple stimuli very close to her. But if she doesn't concentrate and just jerks around, she's not going to catch anything. So this is kind of like Tai Chi. You have to learn to control your motion and control your impulses as well in a very buzzy environment. OK, je vais te sortir. Puis on va aller voir le lab parce que c'est mon préféré. I'm going to show you my favorite, which is the lab. And I was telling you that some are more linked to activities of daily living. So this is one. And it's very challenging. So Anne is going to start 2 different recipes and on 2 tablets. And she's going to have to fulfill those recipes in parallel. So you can see she can move the tablets around. So there's some strategic planning, or how are you going to organize your environment. And when the counter reaches the color section, she has to pour the correct ingredient. Always keeping in mind that she has 2 objectives to fill at once. And sometimes the objective, in this case, both objectives can be filled, but sometimes you need the same bottle in 2 places, and you have to just decide what you're going to do. So this is something that's really, really linked to activities of daily living. Things like making your own food or paying attention to two things at once. And we know that people who are in early stages of dementia, what we call MCI, so it's mild cognitive impairment, this is the kind of things that are going to fail first. They can probably function in everyday life, But when the stimuli start to build up, when there's too much things going on, they're not going to be able to focus. So it looks a lot like ADHD. Something I haven't said is that we don't target a specific pathology with BOL. Our idea was to make it an all-purpose platform because most cognitive problems kind of look the same. We don't think of it that way, but if you look at somebody with MCI and a kid with ADHD, in terms of how they perform, it's very, very close. And the kind of exercise they're going to need is probably very, very similar. So the next step is really that we're going to be taking those exercises and then trying them with specific pathologies and tweaking them for specific pathologies. But the core of the system is the same. OK, so je vais te sortir de là, Anne. Whoop. So I hope that by now I've convinced you that we pretty much have the coolest job in the federal government, except maybe for astronauts, but even then, it's a tie. So what is it like to be developing in that domain? First of all, you have to think that this is not a AAA game production. Even though we're part of a very big institution, the lab itself pretty much functions like a very, very small indie studio. We have to be able to do everything ourselves. So on a typical day, I can be modeling something in Blender in the morning, reading neuroscience papers at lunch, and then soldering wires on an Arduino in the afternoon. So we have to be a very all-purpose researchers, which is not typical of researchers. Normally, you have a very narrow field of expertise, and that's what you're working on. At NRC, the whole team is pretty much people who can do many things and can learn to become experts in whatever comes their way. We also have competing interests because we do this, but we also do consulting work for Canadian industries. If somebody has a business and they say, we are interested in exploring that domain, but we don't have 5 researchers just waiting to do research, we can do consulting for them. So it's always a question of balancing the work that brings the money, that funds our research, and our own internal research. So in that sense, we work a lot like a small game studio. What is different is that we need to work with clinicians very closely. And that's why entrepreneurs often fail. It's hard to get your feet into hospitals, especially if you're not the NRC. But even for us, it's hard to get working with clinicians and people who work with those populations all the time. And they are, for very good reasons, protecting their very vulnerable patients. They don't want to test anything on their patients. So first of all, we need to think of scientific evidence all the way through the process. We know that we're not going anywhere with this unless we have very bulletproof evidence that this works. And we also have to plan for cyber sickness. In VR, we tend to think that cyber sickness is pretty much a solved issue, that with new platforms, it's not so much of a problem as long as you don't put people on roller coasters, they're not going to get sick. But with the population we're working with, this is a very significant concern. Especially since we're not sure yet. We haven't tested VR a lot with vulnerable populations. But we know, for instance, that people who've had concussions tend to be more sensitive to cyber sickness. There is some evidence that older people might be more sensitive to cyber sickness. So we really need to plan ahead for that. If you notice, we never move the user without them moving for real in the environment. We try to minimize a mismatch between what they're feeling and what they're moving. We've tried to limit rotation. So like in the butterfly, you can rotate, but we don't have them rotate really fast. So we try to plan it for that. Yes?
Eye strain. Like I know I for one, I wear glasses, which is part of the problem. But if I wear a VR helmet for 5 minutes, I will have a headache for about 5 hours.
Part of that that depends on what VR system you're using. The low-cost ones, for sure, I get migraines with the Gear VR because they're not fast enough. The one we've seen with the least amount of problems is really the HTC Vive. But we've been doing early testing on cyber sickness, and ocular and eye symptoms are the biggest concern.
How long the session would you expect the people?
It really depends from one person to another. We've been testing people for short sessions so far, and it wasn't a significant issue for anyone. But among all the possible symptoms, that was the one that seems to be cropping first. Yeah, so that's more significant concern, especially since our populations are likely, if you're talking about older adults, most of them are going to be having eyesight issues. So we have to plan for that ahead of time, but we also have to keep track of them throughout the process and reassure clinicians that this is something we take seriously. Finally, the other thing is that development cycles are really, really long. Just going through an ethics approval process can take months. So this is why the NRC is investing in this. We know that most startups are not going to be able to survive long enough to bring a product to market. They're just going to die sometime during the ethics approval process. So hopefully what we're hoping with that project is to build that kind of evidence and to build a base of knowledge that we can then transfer to industry and have startups deal with the putting things on the market and making things nicer and all the things that they're good at, but on a solid scientific basis. This is a very, very fulfilling job. I'm counting my blessings every day that I get to do this. And it's a very interesting field. It's just very important that we do things the right way and build up the scientific evidence that is necessary to actually bring medical tools to people and not just nice gimmicks that exploit their lack of care. Thank you very much. I will be happy if you have questions, and we can probably have a few minutes. 15 minutes? We can have a few minutes, so if people want to give it a try, just come forward and we can have you test it. Yes?
I've been dealing with Alzheimer's for 15 years due to my mom. And even before that, when she was just in the beginning of the process. Have you tested this with actual Alzheimer's patients? Because I cannot see my mom ever wanting to do anything like that.
We haven't, but the Geriatric Institute in Montreal, are part of our consulting partners have. They're not working, we're not talking about people who have actual established Alzheimer's, probably not. Or maybe, but in a different kind of setting. For them, it would probably be more of a, let's put them in a very comfortable virtual environment that lets them forget they're in a hospital. But we're talking more about people who have the very early signs of dementia, who are probably right now in their 60s, still working, still driving their car, still going grocery shopping, but are starting to feel themselves decline. Well, hopefully not. But we know that there's a condition called MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment. And it can be the beginning of Alzheimer's, but it can also stabilize and stay there, or even resolve itself. And there's not enough scientific evidence about MCI right now to know exactly what is the right recipe to fix it. But we're hoping that this is part of the solution. And this is not something that is intended to be a replacement for existing therapy. It's supposed to be something that is added on to actual therapy and used along with clinicians who are going through the regular process, but also adding this on top. This is also something that these kinds of tools are also starting to get traction with people who have strokes. ACV. So people who had a problem and are in rehab for motor problems, but also cognitive problems. So these people, we know we're not able right now to give them the level of care that they would need. We just don't have enough resources. So if we can use that to double the amount of rehab they're going through, chances are it's going to give them a lot of help. Did that answer your question?
Well, basically, yeah, you're not really aiming for Alzheimer's patients.
Yeah, but we haven't, in the domain, the hardest population to work with in terms of acceptance of VR is autism kids. Older patients don't seem to be that reluctant to using VR, even people who don't have a lot of experience with computers.
No, it's more the sense of fear of not understanding what's going on.
Yeah.
Of being vulnerable. It's just like walking in a room where there's one person that she doesn't know. And I'm seeing that with all the other Alzheimer's patients also in the where she is. Because they feel so vulnerable, anything new makes them really, really afraid. So like she would freak out.
Okay.
She would totally freak out.
I haven't talked about it, but we also have a whole biomonitoring side to this. We have biomonitoring sensors for things like stress levels and heart rate and even EEGs. So we have EEG headsets that can plug into this, and we can monitor those stress levels as well. So this is something that a clinician would be monitoring all the time, and we could have a feedback loop that helps us deal with this. Questions? Yes?
Of the lower cost systems, which one do you have the best experience with? And why?
I am very skeptical of low-cost systems because I tend to be very sensitive to cyber sickness. So most of them give me headaches. What we've been working with, which is quite interesting, is what we call low immersion VR, which is just basically, I don't have my cell phone close by. It's just basically handheld VR where you have a vision that is monocular, but if you turn around, you have your screen. So you still have your contacts around, and you have some sense of immersion, but it's not fully immersive. And that there's no cyber sickness issues. So for people who are not able to support well the VR headsets, this is an interesting way of finding a bridge. It's a lot less. There's no sense of presence, but you can play with those ideas of VR for people who are vulnerable to headaches. Yes?
I was just wondering, how do you develop your user stories, and how can you eventually maybe use your tool as a diagnostic?
Okay. We don't really focus on assessment or diagnosis. In part because it's a lot of researchers have been studying assessment with VR, and pretty much no one is trying to work in remediation. So our goal is really remediation. And there is some, we monitor everything that's going on. So there is some monitoring behind the scenes that let us observe if a patient is improving in the game. But it doesn't say us if they're improving their life. And as I was saying earlier, that's our golden standard. In terms of how we develop these, we don't have a very formal process. We're a very, very small team, so it's pretty much Anne and I, we read through the scientific evidence. We look at how traditional cognitive rehab is being done. We talk with clinicians, and we pretty much get an idea and do it. We've been working in a very informal, agile kind of way, but we don't have any formal Scrum process in place with just two of us.
We have a lot of clinicians that backs us.
Yeah. And we have demos of this continuously throughout the process with clinicians who tell us, like, this is not working, or yes, I think you're on the right path.
Are you in this research? 15 to 20?
Yeah, the whole lab is 15 to 20 people. I can show you the video back. The simulation lab has 3 main research interests. The first is simulation for surgery training. We're the second, and the third is more remote care. I can show you a little nice demo full of Canada flags. So the whole lab is about 20 people, but the cognitive side is we're 4, and we're working on, like right now we have 3 projects in parallel, two that are with customers and this one. So we're pretty much like Madeleine de Versailles. We're trying to pretend that there's a lot of us shooting guns, but there's actually we're actually a very small team. So that's why I was saying we pretty much work like an indie studio. And we have a level of independence that is surprising for a big federal institution. We pretty much do what we think is going to have impact, and the scientific evidence is our test. Yes?
I have a question about cyber sickness. Is it something you can train for? Is it something that can go away if you use the systems more, or something that always?
Yes, there is definitely a training part of it. The more you use a system, the less your symptoms are going to be present. But it's not something that has been proven scientifically. But what most people say is that if you start feeling sick, stop. Yes. Because it just gets worse. So there's an habituation process, but you shouldn't push through the nausea because you're just going to get sick. One thing that is hard to do is that sometimes cyber sickness and anxiety symptoms are very similar. So it's not so much an issue for us, but for somebody like Stéphane Bouchard, who is working with anxious patients, sometimes they have cyber sickness symptoms before they start. And you kind of have to push them through the symptoms because, of course, they're not comfortable facing their trigger. That's the point of exposure therapy. So in this case, it's a bit more like he is pushing the line a bit more because if he says to people, stop the minute you're not feeling comfortable, they're going to stop way before they've put on their headset. But for us, we can easily tell people like just stop, and if it doesn't work, we're going to switch to the HoloLens because the HoloLens is a see-through device. So we have the same games working with the HoloLens for the most part. So we can switch to a less immersive platform. We can switch to handheld VR. So we have options if people are not feeling well. Oui.
You spoke about the mental cognitive. Is there also the physical rehabilitation?
We don't, but there's obviously a lot of research being done in the ecosystem about physical rehab. It's actually more advanced, I think, on the physical side. Most VR for physical rehab are using cave systems, though. A cave system is a system of projectors that show you a 180 or sometimes 360 scene with projectors, and you probably have a treadmill that you can walk on and you can interact with the scene. So it's less used with HMDs, head-mounted displays, because of the risk of falls or the risk of getting confused if you are on a treadmill with a helmet on. It's a bit more dangerous. But there's certainly been research for that. And especially at the Ottawa Rehabilitation Hospital, they have an awesome setup, an awesome cave with a double treadmill that can tilt and all that. And they're using that for actual results, including with people who are kind of in between, like people who have had concussions, so they have both physical and cognitive symptoms. So often we just overlap because there's a concept in rehab of dual task. We know that people are getting better real-life outcomes if they challenge their body and their brain at the same time. So the people in physical rehab are often adding cognitive tasks to their physical rehab, and we are adding physical components to our cognitive rehab. So we pretty much overlap. Oui?
I was wondering if you know which area of the scale there is more research on VR. Like, for example, a year ago Research funding. I stopped there because the research was initial research funding. So I was wondering now how it works. So it's like more research in the area of the autism, or it's like the other domain of healthcare?
There's not that much research in VR and autism because everybody's scared of how kids are going to react.
Okay. That time they said that they start to put more research in the autism.
That there might be more money, but in general, I think it's a tough area of science to be gathering money for because it's still a bit fuzzy. You know, it's not very well defined. Neuroscience in general is not very well defined, and if you add on VR to it, it's complex already. And also because most money comes from, I would say the area where there's the most money is post-traumatic syndrome because of the military. Like for sure, if you want to make money in this, go for PTSD and military users because the military is very interested in this. Other than that, I think it's a tough area for funding.
Like anxiety and other emotions?
I don't know. Part of the reason why the NRC is investing in this in general is that this is a tough area to get funded for. So if we're able, like we have on the reins solides, like I'm not going to go bankrupt. My mortgage is still going to get paid even if this takes a long time. So that's why we're investing in this in general to help the whole ecosystem. But I don't know if there are any conditions that are specifically easier to get funding for. Oui.
So yeah, I find it super interesting that you're investing to potentially help like startup take your findings and do like amazing things. How do you see that going like in the future? Like how do you see people building on your knowledge and creating value from all your research?
There are different ways. The NRC in general has several ways of helping industry. If you're an entrepreneur, by the way, and you're more than 2 or 3 people working, you should know your IRAP representative at NRC. There's something called the PARI, or IRAP, Programme d'aide à la recherche industrielle. I don't know what it is in English. And there is an IRAP representative in pretty much any region. And they're the gateway to federal funding. So if you are an entrepreneur and you don't know who is your IRAP representative, look on the website and call them, like today. Maybe not today, but on Monday. Because these people can channel you to all kinds of federal funding, some of which are fairly easy to get. One thing we can do at the NRC is something called the 40 hours program, where you can have a researcher working for you for 40 hours for free if you're a small business and you have a well-defined research problem, or you say, like, I would like to know, can you do a business market research for what is in that field? Or I have this problem and I'm not sure I'm going in the right way. Can I have like 40 hours of 5 people with a PhD working on this? And this is something people don't know about. So this is one of the modes. You can get funding through the IRAP process as well. This is a more lengthy federal funding program. We do consulting. So especially small businesses can have access to our services at a reduced rate. And I think this is something that was reconducted in the new budget. So we don't know exactly the limits of that program, but there should be money for SMEs, small businesses, to get access to research services. And this, we're hoping to license it. So we're going to segment it in pathologies and licenses to businesses who can sell it and give us back part of the royalties so we can fund future research. So that's going to be the commercialization model for this. And for let me see, like this is our flagship product. This is the NeuroVR. And this is something that was designed alongside the same kind of model. It was developed at NRC in partnership with hospitals. And when it reached a point of maturity, CAE took it and marketed it. So right now it's sold as a CAE product, but it's all designed and developed at NRC. So this is kind of the way we're going with BeWell. We're going to build something up and have it licensed. But we're hoping that the entire ecosystem can learn from what we're learning and build upon that, even if they're directly selling our BeWell.
One last question. Are there other technologies being explored this way, like other new technologies like Internet of Things, social components of technology, and that kind of thing?
Yes. In our lab, we're exploring anything that is related to remote care. So being able to have sensors at home that talk to your practitioner and all that. We're exploring AI. So can we have intelligent avatars? We saw a bit of that at the end of the video. We're exploring also AI in terms of analyzing BeWell and all the output and being able to support the clinicians. So this is just what we're doing at NRC, but of course there's a lot of work being done elsewhere as well.
What kind of requirements do you have for licensing the VR?
What do you mean licensing in terms of licensing our product?
Yes, exactly. Like building your product.
We're not at that stage yet. So right now we're gonna build the scientific evidence. We're gonna see how we sell this afterwards. But until we have scientific evidence.
But which party has to give you the license for it?
No, we're gonna be doing the license. Like companies are gonna pay us for the license.
Gotcha.
So, thank you guys.
Merci beaucoup.